Howdy, yes, it's another episode of the Gaily Podcast. I'm Alex.
And I'm Robin.
Today's guest is Mauree Turner. They're running for House District 88 in Oklahoma, and they won against incumbent Jason Dunnington in their primary. They would be the first Black Muslim non-binary person to take office if they win in Oklahoma. Mauree has a ton of history advocating for criminal justice reform and plans to bring that experience to the state capitol if they win in November. So before I go any further, let's jump into the episode.
You put your hat in the race just months before the primary, and you beat the incumbent, Jason Dunnington. What inspired you to join at the last minute?
I wouldn't necessarily say it was the last minute, but so when I hit the ground running doing community organizing, specifically in Oklahoma City about 2 years ago, and even more so before that when I was interning and working with the Council on American and Islamic Relations. Sorry, that's my nephew. If you hear him like cooing in the back. I just realized that House District 88 being one of the most liberal, if not the most liberal place in Oklahoma, we should be the place where we are making, or we are having those meaningful and those heartfelt conversations about what equitable and diverse policy looks like. We deserve someone who's a community organizer, who has been doing this work like in communities for years, right? So folks who have been picking up the pieces that our government kind of, picking up that infrastructural shortcoming that the government leaves for us, right? Filling those gaps. And so when I hit the ground back in 2018, I also started looking for folks to run because this was never the end goal for me. So I was looking for community organizers to run, folks with shared lived experiences, folks directly impacted by the system. And so, or these institutions, right? And so that was like my first go-to, was to look for folks. And so then folks started asking me if I was going to run. And the plan was to never run for office. First, the plan was to never run for office, and then the plan was to never run for office unless my community asked me to. So I decided I would go ahead and listen to the advice I'm always giving to youth, whether it's in Generation Citizens courses or anything else like that, or the alternative schools that I go and talk to about why it's important that we see ourselves and the folks who make, interpret, and enforce policies about our everyday lives. So I did listen to my community that was asking about seeing ourselves and those who make the decisions about our lives. And so that was, and it was like, I think the final straw was because I had a lot of coffees with folks that had asked me to run. I've received like Twitter and Instagram DMs about running, and like the straw that broke the camel's back was like, I had one last DM and literally it just said, "Hey, happy Wednesday. I think you should run for office." And I was like, all right, let's do it. So, say it again.
Oh, it's meant to be.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about House District 88 because the first openly gay House member and lesbian House member have both been a part of House District 88. What do you bring to the table to Oklahoma politics with your background and your experience?
Right, for sure. I think for me, it's the big part about the shared lived experiences. So growing up in Oklahoma's public education system, growing up having a family, or not a family member, having one of my parents incarcerated, and seeing the grip that our carceral system holds holds on families long after they've left the prison system, because you don't just incarcerate one person, you incarcerate an entire system, right? A community. And so the shared lived experience of having that background of family members who are directly impacted by our prison system and me being impacted by our prison system, right? The shared lived experience of fighting for religious freedoms, right? Not just being an ally, but actually like living that experience. Being born and raised Muslim in Oklahoma is it's an uphill battle. And I think if you ask my friends, a lot of them will tell you that I came out as queer before I came out as Muslim to them. And some people will hear me say that relational organizing really saved my life. And I think in this day and age, what I mean by that is that like spending that time for my friends growing up throughout elementary, because that was something that I was very like always consciously doing throughout elementary school, throughout middle school, was making sure that my friends got to know me outside of my sexual orientation, outside of my religion, right? And so once I was able to come out as queer and come out as Muslim, a lot of my friends were like, oh, okay, like I didn't understand, like we didn't know these things, and so we got to have those conversations, right? There were some folks who left and didn't want anything else to do with me, but so growing up directly impacted by our system, whether that's our legal system, our religious institutions, what so have you, and community organizing. I was raised by community organizers, my mother, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles. It was a system of folks who understood the importance of building deep community-based power. And so I think that a combination of those things and who I am really kind of set the standard for leadership that we should be looking for in Oklahoma.
And you're from Ardmore, right?
Yep.
So what are some of your earliest memories with community organizing in Ardmore?
Absolutely. So my very first ones, when it comes to community organizing, so in elementary school, if I was missing school, it was a good portion because probably I was with my mom at an HIV and AIDS awareness conference or an LGBTQ plus like community advocacy conference, things like that. Also, I grew up in yet again like Ardmore, Oklahoma, on the other side of the tracks, right? And was a latchkey kid. So I spent a lot of my time either at the house or at our neighborhood community center. And it was back when I was growing up, it was free. And it was just nice to be able to take a break from a school system that didn't necessarily look like me, and to be able to go into an after school system or an evening and weekend system, community-based that of folks who looks like me, right? I got to learn things about my community and different things like that. And so like being able to, so going on those conferences with my mom, that was our bonding time, right? So I got to learn about her, but also got to learn about community organizing, and then also that community organizing aspect in our community center. But also, I grew up, so my dad is Muslim and my mom is Baptist, or was Baptist, and so we grew up in a Baptist church, right? So there was community organizing in every aspect of my life, and honestly, it really kind of, it molded me to who I am today, right? In a very big part, because community-based power and community, like understanding that we can't make real changes without the community around us, was just kind of how I was taught, right? So honestly, everything from school to extracurriculars, it all was community-based, so.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about just, your intersecting identities and growing up in Ardmore, Oklahoma. That must have forced you to kind of like realize how dark the world is very early on. And how did that influence your policy making?
Oh my goodness. So there were a lot of things, I think, that and things that I'm continuously learning that will influence my policy making. But I think kind of like the broader scope was the fact that everybody lives different lives, and you won't be able, I'm sorry, if like the train is like drowning me out.
No, you're all good.
I'm like literally sitting on the porch in Ardmore, Oklahoma right now. So I think it was a combination of a lot of things, and learning and understanding that we all come from different backgrounds, and there are some things that I won't be able to necessarily experience, right? But the important part is to be able to listen to folks, right? To be able to understand where they're coming from and understand those hardships, right? That intersectionality, that while I might not hold one of those intersections, that there are people who do, right? There are people who suffer and suffer differently than I do, right? Mm-hmm. Who suffer, who survive, right? Who overcome differently than I do. And so that was kind of a big part. And I think for me, one of the, like, my mom and I had a lot of kind of defining conversations throughout elementary school, but I think one of the ones that I think back to a lot was how I had a rough day in elementary school, and I don't know, was I in first? I was probably in first grade. Sorry, my mom's over here too.
Hi, Mom.
You say hello. But I remember coming home, and what I felt like was just like a rough day, and I'm a Capricorn, so like I have always been like pretty self-aware. But I remember having a rough day, and I come home and I talk to my mom, and I'm just like honest with her, and I was like, you know what, today feels like it would have been a lot better if I was white. And to be a first grader, was I in first grade when that happened? Yeah. Second grade. I was in second grade when that happened. And to be in elementary school, right? To be a second grader and to be aware of those things, and to be able to, one, to be able to have those kinds of conversations with my mom, two, to be self-aware and understand that, but also I think it kind of formulated a fact that like, I feel like this, and there are other people who feel like this too, right? And to understand that like, there will be things that we will forever have to overcome, right? In community, in public education, in policy making. And if we are not willing to listen to folks and to sit down and have those deep, difficult conversations, then it's going to make our work a lot harder, right? So like at the legislature and community work period, right? So if that answered your question.
And then yeah, but how do you reconcile with, I mean, in Oklahoma, you know, we overwhelmingly voted for Trump.
Mhm.
So how do you reconcile with people that you'll be representing who voted for Trump and maybe won't agree with you on everything? How do you meet them halfway, or even just like have a dialogue with them?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time like is kind of the verbiage that we use sometimes. And so when I say meeting people where they are, I mean like legitimately, like if that's in like coffee shops, houses, homes, but also in the words that we use, right? A lot of people have not been exposed to verbiage that includes them. And I think that even like with my own kind of identities, those are things I had to find throughout elementary school, middle school, high school, college now, right? Continuously, words are changing, vocabulary is changing about how we talk about things. And so if we are able to do that shadow work, right? So things that don't make us famous on Instagram or Twitter, right? But the work that really kind of, that we sit with and that hurts sometimes, right? But creates space to learn and grow. I think that does phenomenal work. I think it's also understanding that a lot of the times when it comes to a shift in power dynamics, and so I mean, like if we are able to shift from that power dynamic of this Trump administration, it's scary, right? A lot of people who live their lives in the majority are about to have to reconcile with something that they've never experienced before. And that is really scary. And so having that conversation that humanizes the fact that like being scared to move to the next step is very, very real, but also like there are folks who have had to live their lives in this scary like system their entire lives. Like I'm 27 and people continuously ask me like, how do you like someone asked me the other day was like, how do you qualify being Black, Muslim, and queer? And people continuously like ask things like that. And I think it's because like those are the words that they've been given, but like and maybe they don't mean any harm, right? But figuring out how we have those conversations in an equitable way, right? Where we're not asking folks to relive trauma, but actually to grow and learn with us. And so I think it's being able to have a little bit of air of grace when we're having those conversations, but also understand that we're in 2020 and time just keeps ticking and moving, and we should be able to grow and learn with the times too, right? So not just taking ownership for someone else's feelings, but also, but like bringing them into the conversation and also saying like, but it's also time that you give a little bit too, right? I'm giving something in order to grow and learn with you, and I need you to be in that space with me.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know how you deal with the hate and ignorance that you get online, because, you know, you posted some picture of Ilhan Omar when she endorsed you. I was just seeing some crazy shit like like, oh, now she doesn't like America. Oh hell no. Just like absolute crap. Like how, I cannot imagine how you even stay sane being able to deal with that.
Honestly, like like some of the things I think were pretty jarring when I first saw them. Sorry, I don't know if you can some of the
You're
things
good.
like were pretty jarring when I first saw them. But yet again, like cannot reiterate enough. Like I did everything I could because I knew that that was coming. Right, that was something I was actively preparing for. Um, uh, but it doesn't mean like you won't feel anything when it comes, right? But one thing I did
Mhm.
kind of find solace in was that like the things that I was saying were mostly coming from outside of Oklahoma. I think it would have hit a lot differently if the things that I saw were coming from folks inside of Oklahoma. And so it means
Mhm.
that like, but also to take a step back and say like, these are things like, so there are some friends that I did not tell that I was Muslim and queer until college, but there are some folks that knew like growing up, right? I came out to my mom also in the second grade, and so um, these are things that I've had to live with and deal with like my entire life, and so that has really prepared me for it. But also in being able to, so it wasn't just like I got an Omar, a Congresswoman Omar endorsement. We sat, like we had conversations, like we talked about it, and like it was able, like it was at visibility, because I remember like back in 2016, back in 2018, I saw this woman, this phenomenal woman, and I was like, she looks like me, right? Like this is amazing, right? And it was so transformative for me, right? And then to be able a few years later to sit down with her and say like, hey, I'm thinking about running and I want to know like your thoughts. How did you navigate these things, right? To be able to form that system and get that kind of that knowledge and just to be able to create a space for us to learn and grow together was amazing and really helped with whatever was coming, right? And then also like my friends and my family. I help my mom and my sister. I come down on the weekends and help take care of my nephew and my friends that I still have the same group of friends that like I grew up with. Like we all went to college together. We all grew up in Ardmore together. And so they were very, very, like I leaned on my friends and family very, very hard throughout this campaign. And just being able to have that support system really, really helped. And also, I'm not gonna lie, and I don't know if it sounds vain or not, but like this election like is historic, right? Our primary was historic. Our general will be historic. And it felt really good to walk away from the primary with more than just a moral victory, but an actual victory. But the fact that like people saw themselves in this campaign in a lot of different aspects, like over 400 individual donors to a state House of Representatives election is unheard of, right? Over or around 90 individual volunteers, like things like that are unheard of. And I think it's because like we didn't come out to do a campaign, but we made a movement, right? We are continuing on this movement. And so like that also really helped to see that like while a lot of hate came from outside of Oklahoma, so did so much love and support. And so like honestly, like yet again, like that community-based like healing too is what was really kind of transformative about this campaign and really helped me get through it.
It must have been overwhelming just getting the election results and beating an incumbent that's been there since 2014. Like
Yes.
I would break down in tears if I were you. That's beautiful.
Like people will tell you like I don't cry much and I don't really get nervous about too much because yet again like navigating life solely as a Black woman in Oklahoma, like there are a lot of things that just kind of really desensitize you. And so, but like when the election, like the day of the election, me and my mom were just kind of driving around doing different things. We went and got food from the Loaded Bowl. She really likes the Loaded Bowl. I really like the Loaded Bowl. And so like we go to the diversity center a little bit early to set up. And about an hour before, like I kind of start shaking a little bit. And then like my best friend and brand manager like was coming in and he was like just kind of giving me a few little updates. And then like once the actual results were or when the initial like final results were in, my campaign manager came in and he was like, I just like want to let you know like we won a majority of the precincts, because like the news that I had heard before that was that the incumbent had won the mail-in votes. And I was like, because in my head I was just like, everybody's going to mail in vote, like that just makes sense, but also it's like inaccessible, right? Poll taxes, Oklahoma legislature, things will hope to change in the future. But, and so I was already like, okay. And so in my head, I was like, okay, so we didn't do it, but that's okay. We'll do it next time. And then the initial final results rolled in, and my campaign manager, Aaron Wilder, came in and he said, so we won, I think like 9 of the precincts. And I was like, okay. And I was trying to wrap my head around it because in my head, I wasn't like sure what he was saying. And I was like, wait, so are you saying that we're going to the general election? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, wow, like, okay. And then I was like, okay. And so I, like, the shaking kind of stopped. And then I looked at my mom and my nephew and I just cried. And I was like, we did it. Like, and I couldn't be more proud. Because it wasn't just me, Aaron, and James that did it. It was literally those 400 plus donors. It was those 90 individual volunteers. It was House District 88 that showed up, and they had been asking for change for a long time, and so they brought it. It had nothing, not so much to do with us, but more so House District 88 and everybody that kind of was here to build this movement. And so it was shocking, it was jarring, and yeah, I'm still kind of trying to like reel it down and come back and center and get ready for the general, but like we're here and it feels really good. Yeah.
Even Jason Dunnington like said something really nice about you, and he was like, I'm so glad that you're gonna be able to beat who's running against you on the Republican ticket.
His name is Kelly Brady.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Has he been hostile towards you? Has he talked to you? What's been your relationship like with him?
We have not spoken to each other. I have not heard from him. The only thing that I've seen from him is his website, and that's about it. So hoping that maybe one day we'll get a chance to sit down and talk, but if that doesn't happen before the general election, it's not something I'm worried about. We have started our volunteering opportunities, and we're going to hit the ground, and we have hit the ground running, right? And doing this like he's about to run the best campaign we've ever seen, right? And so that's all I'm worried about right now.
Yeah, and so I just want to talk about like the issues that you bring up on your website. You said that the state has brought middle of the road solutions to big issues like criminal justice reform, education, and wage reform. These are all obviously like big and daunting issues that most politicians mention, but what concrete steps would you like to take to make that change, starting with criminal justice?
For sure. I think it's important to note that so back in 2018, there was this expansive package of criminal justice reform initiatives or pieces of legislation. And when I say expensive, I think there were like probably maybe 15 of them. And at the end of it, all we saw was the state question 780 retroactivity piece. Like that was the only criminal justice reform piece of legislation that made it through. And I think like in a state like Oklahoma, where we don't have angrier people, we don't have worse people, we just have more archaic and more gender biased laws, we actually have to take a step forward and rather than just pay lip service to the fact that like, oh yeah, we had the largest commutation in history. We had the longest commutation in single sitting commutation in U.S. history. Rather than just being proud about that, it's like really pouring into the justice reform initiatives that we want, right? So the 780, like the way it was originally written, like there were so many more people that should have been reunited with their families, but it was nipped and tucked, and the process was really bottlenecked, and so. Even in 2019, honestly, up until 2020, I still get phone calls of family members who are waiting for their family members to come home, right?
Wait, before you go any further, can you explain 780 for our viewers who don't understand it?
Yes. Okay, so 780, state question 780 happened back in 2016, was on the ballot. And so what it did was take minor property offenses and drug offenses from felonies to misdemeanors, meaning like you wouldn't go to prison, you would pay a fine, things like that. And so So criminal or justice reform initiatives were things that folks had tried to get passed at the legislature for years, and it didn't work. And so we understood that if we needed to make real change, then we had to put things like that in the hands of the people, which is where state questions come from. There are groups of people who really believe in something. They come together to form a state question about them, and then the people get to vote on them rather than your representation getting to vote on it. Which is how we get Medicaid expansion in 2020, thanks to State Question 802. So justice reform legislation people had been looking at it and trying to pass it in the legislature for years, and it didn't happen. So we got State Question 780 back in 2016, and it took drug offenses and property offenses from felonies to misdemeanors. And that, and I think the thinking behind creating that, taking those things from felonies to misdemeanors, was the fact that the top 3 things that drive Oklahoma's prison system are property offenses, drug offenses, and if you go to prison in Oklahoma, you stay roughly 80% longer than any place else for those things. Right. So which gets us to State Question 805, which will be on the ballot this November as well. But sorry, I went on a tangent. But so
no, you're all good. I love
780
it.
Is okay.
Mm-hmm. And then can you explain 805 for us?
Yes. So how 780 tackled the property offenses and drug offenses, State Question 805 tackles the fact, or sorry, I guess this might be too low now, tackles the fact that if you go for those things, you stay roughly 80% longer. So it puts an end to sentence enhancements. So a lot of the times for drug offenses and for property offenses, you see people stealing and or selling property that does not belong to them, or selling drugs. And because we also create, and it's like a cyclical thing, which is like where all my platforms kind of come from, but the fact that we don't have an economic system in Oklahoma that creates a space for families barely survive. And so we know that they're not thriving here. We don't pay them enough, right? So that's where our living wages come from. But so families or individuals end up sometimes doing these things in order to make ends meet, right? Because we have 1 in 5 families in Oklahoma as a whole has to choose between what basic essentials to provide for their families each month. And so that's when we get our drug offenses and our property offenses, our drug charges and our property charges. And so if you've been in contact with the prison system or the jail system once and you come in contact with them again, so rather than giving you the maximum of what that carries, so say you got in trouble for property or drug offenses once, and then you got in trouble for property or drug offenses again, and the weight of that is 2 years in prison, they'll a lot of the times prosecutors will look at you and say, well, this happened before and you didn't learn your lesson, so we're going to give you past the maximum. So if it was 2 years, then sometimes they'll give you 10 years. And when it comes to drug offenses, this is why we have people in Oklahoma sitting in prison for life for drug offenses, right? Rather than creating an economic floor where folks don't have to sell drugs to make ends meet, we could raise the living wage and we could really eliminate those things. We could also create a system where an integrated healthcare system where it's not tied to your employer necessarily, but if you need to go to the hospital, you can. Things like that, right? Where we don't lean heavily on a carceral system that's based on revenge, but on community systems that we've actually seen once we pump funds into them, our communities thrive, right? We know that heavily policed areas are not the areas that are the safest, right? Areas with resources are the areas that are the safest. So,
are there any judges that you have in mind that have perpetuated this incarceration system?
Oh goodness, I think the thing that I heavily try to highlight and lean on is the fact that our prosecutors have the most power when it comes to things like that. So 97% of cases that are handled via plea bargain by district attorneys. And so that means that instead of taking your case to trial, district attorneys will say, you could go to trial, but if you lose, you could face 30 years in prison. But if you just go ahead and plead guilty to this charge or a lesser charge, then I'll just give you 10 years in prison. And a lot of the times that happens. And so the power that district attorneys have to change the trajectory of Oklahomans is really phenomenal and also very daunting. We only have 27 district attorneys, and they really uphold our justice system. And we can kind of see that with everything that's going on in Norman and in Oklahoma, in Cleveland County, should I say, and in Oklahoma County. I think one of the big things that are on communities' minds, and I think specifically in House District 88, is the fact that we saw an upcharge. So after the protest happened, we saw an upcharge with folks being charged with terrorism and things like that. And so if district attorneys just like aren't feeling you or aren't having a good day, then they hold the power to make those charges.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that. The district attorney that charged these Black Lives Matter protesters with terrorism, he was a Democrat. So with that being said, I've asked a lot of members of the Democratic Party, how do you reconcile with differences like that? Someone as progressive as you versus someone who's, doing these horrible things.
Yeah. I think a lot of it, I think when it comes to something like that, it becomes a different conversation rather than just like, oh, okay, this is a difference in opinion. That's a difference in morality.
Exactly.
That's a difference and sometimes, and maybe in this case, I don't know, but that's also a difference in weaponizing D's and R's, right? And so I think sometimes people lean too heavily on a D and on an R rather than what truly gets community to its best place at the end of the day. I think we've seen time and time again a lot of folks who moonlight as Democrats and are not. And sometimes when we have folks who are disillusioned by politics or folks who don't do research into politics, that D and that R is like where they get caught up. And so in some cases, people will put a D or an R behind their name in order to win an election because they know that people won't do that research, right? And that's where my work around prosecutorial education really kind of stems from. So,
I mean, that's what you do. You need to run on the truth and what's best for the Oklahoma people. I was talking to a former Oklahoma senator, and they were a Democrat, but they said that they were fighting against Republicans and Republicans, meaning, most Democrats acted like Republicans. And so going back to just incarceration in your own community, your dad must be so proud of you that you're working on these issues. Right.
Yeah. I think so. It was kind of like maybe like that movie-esque serendipitous moment. But so my father and I had been estranged for a while, and but also like in being raised with Islamic and Christian principles, like there's that principle of like honor thy mother and thy father, right? And so truly like loved him and wished the best for him, but like we just like weren't on speaking terms. But one evening when I was doing work with CARE, I think it was a banquet. We had put on a banquet one evening, and my mom came up to the city to attend the banquet, and I got a call from, my mom doesn't leave Ardmore too much. She just walked around the corner. My mom doesn't leave Ardmore too much. So this weekend or this evening, she came up, and I get a call from my great uncle who also went to OSU and was living in Stillwater, and he asked me if I knew about what had happened to my baba, my dad, and he told me that he had a really bad car accident. And so my mom and I left the banquet and we went over. And so for the next week, I got to sit by my baba's side and I got to hear his story. I didn't know he wanted to be a teacher, right? I didn't know that we were honestly more alike than we were different. That moment was like when it all kind of clicked. It was something I always kind of knew at the back of my mind, but that was the moment when it clicked that that was the moment when it clicked that Oklahoma's justice system does a really phenomenal job of tearing families apart long after they leave the criminal system. And that even means like the way that we talk about people, right? People who are justice involved. And so that was the week, because I went to OSU to become a vet. And so like that was the week I was like, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going into community organizing to figure out how to fix Oklahoma's justice system. And so, and like when I first was like, okay, this is it, I'm gonna do it. Before I got to that point, I had called my mom and my dad to talk to them about it, to see like what their thoughts and what their feelings were, because like I also know in politics sometimes people will come after you for some of the most like human characteristics about you, right? And so like wanted to know like how they felt about it, and like how they felt about talking about these things. And my dad, he said, I'm always here. I'm very proud of you. And I couldn't be more proud of you and what you do. And he said, I'm never worried about your future. And I feel really good about the future of Oklahoma. And so I'm very thankful to have the parents that I have, and honestly, to have the upbringing that I had. The horrible things that happen in Oklahoma and the uphill battles that we face are not necessarily things that I think everybody needs to be exposed to, but I wouldn't be here without them. And I'm very thankful for them, and how my mother and my father raised me, and my mother and my grandmother and my aunts and uncles kind of raised me to deal with those things. Yes, from what I know, my dad is very proud.
That is beautiful. And when it comes to you fighting change in Oklahoma, what do you think has been the most, your proudest moment when it comes to making change, besides obviously winning the Democratic ticket for House 88?
Because that was a big one. I think if I had to pick something recent that I've been thinking about and processing, it was like, it wasn't just winning, but it was the amount of people who really understood deep community-based power and why we work in communities before the primary, leading up to it, everybody who had bought into it. And everybody, and then like the folks who realize that is something that is very powerful after. So the calls that I got after on like, I didn't think this was something that was really going to happen, and I'm sorry I wasn't there in the beginning, right? Those calls of people being like, realizing that like community-based power is like where it's at, like that's how we make the change, right? Folks that were like, I didn't think it would happen before, but now I'm on board, and now I understand like why it's important to have community at the center of what we do, right? And I mean, like that's like from folks in community all the way up to folks at the legislature, right? And so understanding that community is it's what brought us to this, and it's what's going to bring us through this, right? And so I think the understanding and folks actually starting to wrap their minds around like how powerful community is, and that's like individuals who are just like, oh, like I didn't know we could do those things, I didn't know we can make that change too. Those folks being like, we do have power, and I'm glad that and thank you for showing that to us. Like that has like been one of the most humbling and one of the greatest experiences that I think I'll ever be able to bear witness to. So if that answered your question.
No, it did. And then when it comes to, being one of the representatives of the LGBT community in Oklahoma, how do you think the LGBT community can improve itself in Oklahoma? Because I've heard a lot of instances where it's been a lot of acts of racism committed, or just misogyny or transphobia. How can you, as a, when you win, and even as a community activist, how can you make change within your own LGBT community?
I think it's still like that same notion of those difficult dialogues, those difficult conversations, and meeting people where they are. But I think it's also, it looks a little bit different in how you formulate those, because the number one thing that I have heard, and like I have had white, gay, cis men call me the N-word and reconcile that with them also being oppressed. And so like it's understanding that this is not the oppression wars, this is not the oppression Olympics, right? Like And the type of oppression that I deal with does not mean that you, and the type of oppression that you deal with don't equate in the sense that it doesn't give you the right to weaponize language against me, right? And understanding that like we go through different things and we navigate those differently, and they will be different, but our liberation is tied together. If I am not completely liberated, you are not completely liberated, and if you are not completely liberated, then I am not. And so I often think about the conversation like where someone asked me to, like what I mentioned earlier, when someone asked me to qualify being Black, Muslim, and queer. And it's that language, right? Meeting people where they are in that language, but also understanding that if you're an ally, then that means that you also do the work, right? Not just painting streets, not just throwing a black square up on your Instagram. It means that you take the time to not only think and have conversations, but you do a little research on your own, right? On oppressive histories. And I think about it also in terms of, so there was this challenge accepted thing that was happening on Instagram. I think it might still be happening where women were uplifting women and throwing up a black and white photo of themselves, and they were just saying like challenge accepted. And so like I started to kind of do a little research on like where that came from, right? And that's that shadow work. And then I saw where Muslim Girl had posted like also like where it came from, but it was like challenge accepted stemmed from the fact that femicide and is running rampant in Turkey right now. There are women in Turkey that are being murdered by current partners, by old partners. And that's what I mean when I talk about shadow work. It's like understanding, because like we use that platform, right, to raise awareness. Like we should be continuously doing that work, continuously doing that research, right? Not just like blatantly saying like, oh, okay, it's a black square, I guess I need to post a black square. Do I need to turn my profile photo blue? I'll turn it blue, right? We got to do that research. We got to dig a little bit deeper. And so when we talk about that in marginalized communities as opposed to minority and majority communities, those conversations, those difficult dialogues look a little bit different, but we've got to, but one thing that holds true is that we've got to continuously like do that work to understand like how I may be playing a role in the oppression of somebody else if I don't do that work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
No, I mean, I was just noticing like in every community that you're a part of, they have some ignorance with another part of your identity, and it's just like, to me,
Yes.
it shows you have a high tolerance for bullshit. That's all I can say, because you're very graceful with that. I applaud you for that, because that's a lot to deal with.
That was like one of my biggest things like heading into this was like because it was something that I always like knew, right? Like each part of like my identity has something that's an issue with another part of my identity. And so like, and that's like why I try to do the work that I do, right? That's why I sit on the like, and I choose the boards that I'm a part of and the community organizations that I join like very carefully to try to always raise awareness about that intersectionality, right? That Kimberly Crenshaw talks about, right? So, and so like, that's why I was like, okay, I will like, I became a board member of Freedom Oklahoma. I became a board member of CARE Oklahoma. I work with ACLU Oklahoma. And before doing all of that, I made sure like my basis work was like with the NAACP of Oklahoma, right? And still am able to do work with them to this day. And so, making sure that like I try to not only highlight and fight for the one kind of topical issue that each of these organizations fights for, but also highlighting that intersectionality. And like, I'm here and I stand in that intersection, and I know I'm not the only one. I know I'm not the only one who stands in this intersection in Oklahoma, right? And so fighting so that everybody else can stand in the same sunlight with me.
Do you get a lot of messages from Oklahomans saying, thank you for representing me? I never thought I would see someone that looks like me running for office in Oklahoma.
Oh my goodness, yes. And like the funny thing about it is it's like it's not even just like from people who are like of age to vote. Like there are kids in the or they're young folks, right, in House District 88 and around Oklahoma that are like, we've never seen someone that looks like us, or I've never experienced a campaign like this, or have been excited about a candidate like this in the way that I am about you, right? And that visibility is like a really big part. In the beginning, a lot of people were worried. They were like, well, why are you running against a safe dim? Like, he's done everything for us. And the thing is, like, it's that topical lens, right? He's done a good portion to bring us to where we are, right? But there are folks who are continuously carved out. And that's what this campaign was about, right? Making sure that everybody, like, we didn't just have an ally, but we had representation fighting for us, folks with our shared lived experiences. And so to get notes from like 7 and 8 year olds about like how they're happy that there's someone that looks like them, right? To hear from fathers of Muslim children saying like, I'm excited that there's a Muslim woman that my children, that my daughters can look up to, right? To think about these things and to hear these things it has been like, honestly, one of the most humbling experiences that I could have ever been a part of. And I'm really grateful to be able to be in this seat. But I think the hope is that Oklahoma would have gotten here some like without me, right? At some point in time, but I yet again can't stress enough like how thankful I am to be in this seat and the messages that I continuously get. I get I get cards, postcards, things like that, and they're all really amazing.
Mm. And another question I have, this is a very basic question, but I love your style. And would you wear your iconic overalls at inauguration?
You know what? I was thinking about it. And like, I really want to. I also have this coveted green tuxedo that I never, like, it's like a forest green velvet tuxedo that I never get to wear. So I'm like thinking about it, but I'm also thinking about getting a new pair of overalls for inauguration. So we'll see.
Please do that. I would love that. And there's one question I always ask everyone that's been on this podcast is, are you proud to be an Oklahoman, and why?
I can say without a doubt that I am very, very proud to be an Oklahoman, and I'm very, very proud to be a member of House District 88. My life was kind of tied to that area long before moving there. My brother went to OCU, and so we always spent time in the city, specifically in House District 88 and in the Paseo. We played music. I don't know, Carlton Dorsey. Some people might know him. I don't know. And so my heart and my body and my soul has been tied to 88 for a long time. But in the communities that I've been a part of and been able to work with, I couldn't be more proud of the Oklahomans that are still here and still fighting. You know, we have a really big like brain drain, but I couldn't be more proud to when I look over and I see community organizers that I get to work with every day, and community organizers like my mother, right, that are still doing this work. I couldn't be more proud to be an Oklahoman and to see that we made this historic stride and that we're continuing to do so. Yes, absolutely.
Man, it feels like Mauree was born to be an activist with all the experience they have. And we want to know what you thought of their story. If you want to learn more about their campaign, we've linked their website below. Once again, I'm Alex.
And I'm Robin.
And you've just watched another episode of the Gaily Podcast.